Greetings, family. Welcome to the Grand Rising Collective. My name is Kyle Dixon, co-host, educator, and entrepreneur for 20 years. Grand Rising Collective's here is to cultivate greatness in ourselves and our community.
And my name is Kaide Bentley, co-host, educator, and entrepreneur for over 20 plus years. My contribution to Grand Rising Collective is to help cultivate that greatness in ourselves and the community through impactful discussions, seminars, and webinars with my co-host, Kyle Dixon.
Greetings, family. This is Kyle Dixon here for another edition, another episode of the Grand Rising Collective podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Kyle Dixon, with my co-host, partner in podcast, Kaide Bentley. Say what up to the people, Kaide.
What's up, everybody? Glad you can join us. We got another good one for y'all. I had a chance to speak with our guest, and I'm excited about what we learned today and what we're able to discuss and break bread. Thank you, Kyle.
Indeed. So we got a special guest for you all today. A professional brother I met in my young career back in Chicago when I was a young educator, just starting out. And I was introduced to him by another mutual friend of ours, Dr. David Stovall. How you doing, my brother?
All good, man. It's good to see y'all.
Indeed, man. So this brother here, has a wealth of information, wealth of experience to share with us today in reference to the educational field, the social activist field, and research as well. Being a doctor, Ph.D., I know research is entailed with that as well. So let's jump right into it. And again, family, before we go in, before we start this, I want you to be able to like, share, subscribe to our channel. We have a plethora, a multitude of episodes for you all to check out, ranging from healthcare, education to music and culture. So please check us out. I know you as David, but I don't know if you want to call me Dr. Stovall, Brother David.
It's whatever's good. It's whatever's good for y'all.
Okay, and the reason I say that, David, and family too, because when we talk about like titles and things, this brother earned it. We have other brothers and sisters on here who have their PhDs or other titles, and we want to make sure we give y'all the respect and proper due, because you put in the time and the work and the effort in that. And the stigma, is that, Black folks aren't educated, Black folks don't achieve, and that's definitely an achievement in itself, right? So I want to just salute you for that. So Brother David, all right. Give the family some background on like who you are, where you're from, just how you got into the educational space.
Definitely. Well, again, thanks y'all again for having me. I'm Dave Stovall. I'm at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm actually in two departments. I'm in the Department of Black Studies, and I'm also in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice. Before that, I was in the College of Education for 18 years and then made a transition into Black Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice. The stuff that I actually look at is critical race theory, the relationship between housing and education, and the ways that communities self-determine to get what they need. So that's really been important for me. And I come to that work by way of community organizers and youth workers. So I actually met a group of folks 30 years ago from Detroit who were doing youth work. And I had never heard the term community organizer. I'd never heard youth work. I just knew that there were people in communities who were working to change conditions. And I actually got put up on that by two of my high school homies. So I come to justice-centered work actually by way of my peers. Wow. So shout to Courtney Smith and Marcus Murray. So those two folks actually put me on to really understand things. And quickly, I was in a chemistry class, and me and Marcus were lab partners. And the teacher was going off about something, and we was in the back, and he was just like, man, look, this is trash. Let's look at this. So he gives me a book called Selective Speeches of Malcolm X. So I start reading Ballad of the Bullet, Message to the Grassroots. So I'm reading this in chemistry class. So that really put me on, and it made me make a connection to the books that my grandmother had on her shelf. So it was really around me being able to make that connection to see what my grandmother had, and now actually being able to look at it differently. And then Courtney, she was a year younger than me, and she was like, look, we got all these Black students in school and we don't got a class in Black Studies. I'm like, oh, that makes sense. She was like, look, I already set it up. Come with me to the principal's office and we're going to get this Black Studies class. So me and her went to the principal's office and started talking, and she got the class up and running. She had already set up a teacher. She had already organized with a teacher to be like, look, I'm about to make this request.
And this is high school.
This is high school. She was 16 years old. So she put me onto it, and it was another lesson for me because I was never able to take the class. Mm-hmm. So she set up the class, and the lesson for me was you do the work for things that you may not even see. So I think it was a really important lesson for me. So from that point on to meeting the folks from Detroit when I was in undergrad, they put me on to community work. And then from there, I just kept on with it and then started to work with folks in housing, education, looking at criminal legal systems, particularly around abolition. So all of these things kind of manifested themselves, I would argue, from my grandmother's bookshelf to my high school classmates.
Wow. I mean, wow. I mean, that's an amazing story, man. I mean, like, that's why I have to reiterate high school. Like, this is high school, like the foresight, you know, and the initiative to be able to do that, man. That's amazing, you know. And again, we've heard of stories, you know, throughout, you know, people's different experiences in different places, but that's still a phenomenal thing because at 16, I was thinking of certain things, but not the initiate and have the confidence to talk to the principal and set things up. Wow. Could you go into, and you and I kind of know this, and Coyote, I've mentioned this to you. Could you go into a little bit of that influence with Chicago? Because Chicago has a lot of that political grassroots history and how that could potentially influence what happened in high school, but also influence you getting into this type of work as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things in Chicago we're kind of forced to grapple with is we live in a deeply segregated city, right? And not just segregated in terms of how people get down with each other, but segregated in terms of the laws, right? So there were restrictive covenants where people could only live in certain places. And you were treated by law enforcement particular ways if you entered into other spaces. And that still resonates with folks. So people have always been organizing to change those conditions. And we live in a city where there's a political machine, right? Mm-hmm. So that machine really ran the city for almost 100 years, right? And you had two people coming from one family who ran the city for almost 50 years, right? Between Richard J. Daley and Richard M. Daley. So now and it's important for folks to put into context. Remember, Old Man Daley was part of a machine, right? He waited his turn in line to get the mayor's office. And actually, he wasn't even supposed to be the mayor, but the guy who was supposed to run ended up dying in a bar, right? So he gets on because he was the money dude for the machine. So the machine said, look, okay, if you get in office, now we can actually operationalize how to control the city, right? So how to control the city in terms of services, infrastructure, and politics. So now when you team up that combination under white supremacy in terms of owning a political machine and living in a segregated space, people aren't going to take that lying down, right? So folks in Chicago often would resist because the rhetoric was, well, how do you expect us to just get dumped on all the time? And now that interruption came by way of folks organizing for affordable housing, healthcare, education, making sure that particularly in schools to make sure that there was proper representation, that communities could self-determine. So I grew up in seeing that, right? And in particular, when I was in grade school, there was a brother who won the mayorship, first Black mayor of Chicago by the name of Harold Washington. And
Yes, sir.
Harold Washington interrupted the machine, right? Nobody thought he could do it, but he was so astute. He knew how to beat the machine, and he knew how to beat the machine at its own game. And that, to me, as a young person, seeing that was important because he was very accountable in his process.
Mm-hmm.
So he said, look, if I can, like, and think about this, this was a mayor who had a ethic to say, if you make a request, I will get back to you in no less than 2 weeks. That's how he operated.
Wow. Okay.
Right. So like he really thought about what was necessary to change conditions, but also he rooted himself in the people. So as a Chicagoan, seeing that as a young person, and he passed away my sophomore year of high school.
Okay.
But seeing that as a young person allowed me to understand that there were folks who were working to change conditions. And from that moment on, I was looking at that, and then essentially got put on by way of my peers.
What was his name again?
Harold Washington.
Yeah. You say that name in the city of Chicago, it brings a smile to people's faces. And actually, Obama talked about it. He talked about it very much, how Washington also being influenced to him because he worked on the campaign.
Yep, and he would talk about how he would go to watch Harold Washington, and he would just be like, "Man, how is this dude doing this? Right? How does he make folks understand what he's talking about?" And that was Harold Washington's gift. His thing was, look, if you are going to be accountable to people, you have to listen to them, and you have to demonstrate that you have listened to them by the actions that you engage. So it was completely that process, seeing that as a young person where I didn't understand all of it, I could get that point. I was like, man, this dude is different. Like he's not like these politicians just trying to get in and get on the horse and ride slick. His thing was, look, if you're going to do some things, we have to do some things. Let's get into the process of doing some things.
Yeah, Harold Washington, man. I mean, yeah, his definitely legacy, like you say, his legacy and his legacy of integrity is what I hear people talk about very much so. And even the small things I've read on him, or the movies, those short documentaries I've seen, it's nothing but integral, man. And he talked to all Chicagoans. It wasn't just Black Chicago. It was like all Chicagoans felt like they had his ear, and they really appreciated that. Wow. Another question I want to ask, David, and you mentioned it about going into politics. Chicago being a Black cultural mecca, like we're in New York City, which is also has a cultural mecca, Harlem, and places in Brooklyn, and even Queens, and even the Bronx. But like, what about Chicago's cultural dynamic mixed with the politics? How does that affect the educational aspect of things, and also resources in regard to education?
Well, it's this thing around culture becomes critical when you talk about schools. So my parents went to a school called Wendell Phillips. Wendell Phillips is on the south side of the city, and it's a school where Nat King Cole, Dinah Washington, Sam Cooke all went to, right?
Right.
So when you thought about, and there was actually a guy who taught music there, a guy by the name of Walter Dyett. And Walter Dyett taught music in those spaces. So Nat King Cole, Dinah Washington, Sam Cooke were his students. Right? So this thing around really putting that in the space. And then because we're in a direct geographic line to Mississippi,
right?
You cross Tennessee, Arkansas, and the like through the Illinois Central Railroad. So the blues comes to Chicago by way of Mississippi, right? To create a different sound, right? So you got Mississippi Delta blues, comes up north, you got Chicago blues, which is really a version of Mississippi Delta blues. So now you have all of those spaces kind of coagulating in Chicago. You have all the people who are looking at this, and then historically that comes out in band culture, right? So now, if you went to certain schools, you would have bands, and those band instructors were really important in maintaining culture. And then because Black people are always creating, you think about the things that people have created. So as a Chicagoan, and you all as New Yorkers see this also, but as Chicagoans, when house music comes out of Chicago, that's the music of young folks, right?
Yes.
That's young folks creating. And schools are important in that space because it's one of the few places where space was made for young people to create. Now, on the flip side of that, you also had a racist superintendent in the mid 60s by the name of Benjamin Willis.
Okay.
Benjamin Willis he wanted to halt white flight because Black folks until 1948 lived in 8 square miles of Chicago. 80% of all Black people lived in 8 square miles. This area called Black Belt, sometimes people refer to it as Bronzeville.
Yes.
So when restrictive covenants was lifted, actually in 1940, but it wasn't really enforced until 1948, Black people started moving to other parts of the city. Mm-hmm. White folks almost instantaneously started moving out. So Benjamin Willis, to curb white flight, he deeply segregated the schools in the area. And if schools were overcrowded, he would put trailers in the playgrounds, and they nicknamed them Willis Wagons. And Willis Wagons were always in disrepair, always messed up. And this was this thing that families fought against. So you had families who were organizing in the city, and to the point where in 1963, there was a walkout of 250,000 students in CPS, right? So this type of space, so schools have always been contested, particularly around resources and geography, right? So depending on where the school is, who the school serves, it deeply determined what resources got to those buildings. And it's still that way today. But to your other question, schools were one of the spaces where Black youth could actually create, whether it be artistically through the visual arts, whether it be through the performing arts, music, and the like. But there's always been this tension around who gets what in the city. And that tension we see is really heavy, not just historically, but in the current moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that breakdown. See, I never knew about the whole Willis Wagon. I never knew about the whole walkout in '63 with 250,000. My mother growing up in Chicago public schools, my aunts and uncles, they never mentioned that, which is interesting. Wow. And that dynamic of those spaces. And like I said, Chicago has a wealth of history, that people don't realize. Like you said, all those artists coming through that one school. And Walter Dyett, I didn't know because I noticed the elementary, Dyett Elementary. So I didn't know, wow. See, wow, that's amazing, man. I mean, again, let's say the history is all around us. And that's one thing I want our family to know. The history is all around us. We just don't have the language or have the insight to know that it's there and what it represents, but it's all around us. I know Kaidi's thinking, Kaidi got that look. He's like, woo, yes, yeah, man. Kaidi, you got a question? I know you contemplate.
Nah, it's a history lesson right there. Just to be authentic, I don't even know how to approach this without doing my best. I'm baffled at how I mean it really baffles my mind at how after all these years we're still here, right? So one of the things I hear you say, Dr. David, is this was back in the 1940s regarding fighting for the resources of schools, particularly in inner cities, and here we are 40 years later and we're still here. I just it baffles my mind sometimes. Sometimes I just got to disassociate because how is that even possible? Right? It's really it really makes no sense because how can we be such a creative people, right? From Egypt, the motherland, Africa, created the pyramids and all this other stuff, and I have my theories on that. But yet, as creative as we are, as many as we are, as how many we have the financial resources that we do, we're still here. So yeah, so whenever history is brought up, I don't know how to take it. Sometimes it's like damn, how many other versions do we have to hear about, disenfranchisement and stuff like that before we wake? Excuse my language. This is the first time I think I'm cursing on our podcast, Cal. But how much does it take for us to wake the fuck up? You know what I
Mhm.
mean? How come we can't, and I get it. I understand
Mm.
Dr. Joy DeGruy, the whole what syndrome, right?
Post-traumatic slave syndrome. Yeah.
Post-traumatic slave
Or
syndrome.
some people say present traumatic syndrome.
Present
Right.
traumatic, you know what I mean? I get it. I know we've been programmed and indoctrinated. I understand that. But at some point, we got to wake up, man. Come on.
Mhm.
There's too much technology today. There's too much information today for us to just willingly stay in this situation. And I also get it, Kyle. You share the underground. There is movement being done. We are making movement, like Dr. David already mentioned as well. We have these cells, so to speak, doing the thing. But the problem is we're still separated. When we're going to start putting our egos aside, putting whatever nonsense we have, and finally coming together and putting an end to this. So anyway, my question, Dr. David, is how do you remain authentic to your experiences with African culture, having become a PhD?
Mhm.
So let me I want to really emphasize that question because, and it could be a stereotype and you could be an outlier. You could be an exception to the rule, which I think you are. But from my experience, I'm very hesitant in putting any trust in anyone who's been educated through a white supremacist system,
Mm.
Mhm.
right? Anyone who has achieved a certain level of education by default has been programmed, right? So I want to know my question to you, and I'm sure, compliments of Cal as well and our audience and our family owner. How have you managed to keep your authenticity after achieving this level of education through a system that's designed to program and indoctrinate you against the development and empowerment of Black people?
Mhm.
Yeah, definitely. No, I appreciate that question. Is by staying doing the work, right? So that thing around exactly to your question, when you are in these doctoral programs, when you are in those spaces, it is a programming. You have to figure out how to actively refute what they're saying and then use what it is that you're doing, that you're engaged in for your people, right? And that's a lot of navigating, but the only way I can navigate that is by still doing work on the ground with the folks that I care about, right? To be outside of that university space, to be energized, to go back into it and say, what will I pillage from this place and bring back to my folks? And I think it's really important for me, it's been important to be in community with folks who understand that, right? Who are willing to say, look, whatever tool we will use. But our commitment is not to that institution. It is not to that PhD. Our commitment is to the folks that we care about, to work with them actively to change conditions, right? I think that really becomes important because you are absolutely right, Kaede. You have pinpointed it because the issue should always be a deep skepticism and distrust of folks who have been trained by that institution, especially when they're coming into community spaces saying that they have something for the community. A practice that I use as somebody who works at a university. When I come into community spaces, I'm like, look, given my occupation, there's no good reason for you to trust me.
Mm.
Because there isn't, now what we can do, you can hold me to account. So now, whatever it is that I am saying, I need to be doing. And if I am not doing those things that that I have purported to do, then you can instantly end that relationship whenever you need to. Right. I think that it's really important to have that level of accountability because, exactly to your point, Kaide, the institution is designed to extract from us, right? It's not designed to put in to us. So now we have to think about what it is that we're doing, on what terms and conditions, and that has to be centered in the people's concerns, not the universities. So that's how I've been navigating that for the last 25 years in terms of being very clear where my commitments are.
Mm.
Never
Mhm.
heard that answer before, Kyle. That's good.
Yeah, man.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
Mm.
Okay, Cal, you had a question out. Yeah, I don't want to knock your wisdom. I'll keep going.
No, I just wanted to ask, like, I want to ask, like, kind of like a turn of the coin question. So, Brother David, when we talk about the people, because we work for the people, Kade, we're educators, we work in the community in the greater New York. Kade has its own organization, 4Ts, teaching teens to think. When we talk about the people, the youth, the children, etc., what about when the people maybe don't know what they want, or the people are misinformed or misguided in what they think they need, but we know they need really this, or they want this, and that's not really what's going to benefit them? How do we create that progressive relationship with the people when we want to work with them and help them, and we see the things that they are probably more in need of, but they've been tricked, they've been miseducated, misinformed to think they need this particular thing more than what's going to actually help them?
Yeah, I think we have to be in relationship with folks, right? And I think like a lot of times people use that term too loosely, but if you are in a space where you know issues and concerns, then you can ask questions and figure out what folks have experienced, and then collectively you can figure out where you want to go. Because a lot of times, to Kaide's first point, people get into their bag around having degrees or what have you, and knowledge or what have you, and that's not necessarily the case, right? Because a PhD just says you wrote a long thing about a little thing and 5 people said you did it. I mean, real talk, right? So we just have to be clear about that. So now if we're in relationship with folks, it's always an exchange. So what is the experience here? What has been seen here? So now, okay, what do we know about that, right? Where does our knowledge stop around this thing? How do we experience this thing? And now, what makes the conditions better for you and the folks that you care about, right? So, I mean, I think when you start to talk with folks in that way, it doesn't privilege one group over the other, but it says, what is known, how we experienced it, and then what is it that we're willing to do given our experience, right? Because to your point, you have people that prey on communities in this way, right? So charter schools do this a lot, right? So they come in communities and say, look, you've had 40 years of shit. We got this new thing. Now, it can't be worse than what you already have. So give us a shot. Now, what that does is it plays on people's desperation. Because if you have a schoolhouse that has not been funded, has not been resourced, then you look and say, well, damn, they got this new thing. They giving away TVs. They got open houses where they doing raffles. You're like, damn, what is this? Right. And then in your rationale, you say, all right, well, damn, it can't be worse than what is there. But again, it becomes the golden handcuff, or a good friend of mine says the shiny noose, right? Because when you come in those spaces, now they got all these rules and regulations on how you move in the world, and then they punish you for it. So that thing really becomes important, back to your question, Kyle, in terms of being clear around what is known, and now how can we go from what's known and what's experienced to something that benefits the folks that we care about. And I think, and there's, to your point, there's tension there, right? Because folks want different things, but this thing around what can we do actively to say, this has better results for more people, right? And that thing around really, because what we're really battling is our own distrust of ourselves, right? So this thing around really getting into why did we come to that space, and now what can we actively do to interrupt it? That's why that integrity and accountability becomes so important, because you can't dip out on folks where you're trying to enhance consciousness.
I never heard that charter schools. Thank you, Doc. Wow. We got to keep. I'm gonna try and get as much information from Doc as I can in this podcast.
Go ahead.
So I have a question. I notice your passion. People mention passion with regards to what I do with four T's. Now, my only way of how can I say being effective with remaining true to myself and my passion is by quote unquote not selling out. So I've been very careful with my organization not to align myself or partner myself with people who do that same damn charter school approach, right? Willing to fund me and my organization, and we can help expand your joint or whatever the case may be. Because subconsciously, and I thank God, always in the back of my head, my question is at what cost? Right? So if you're paying and you're putting so much funding behind me, how much am I going to have to compromise? How much are you going to, in essence, dilute my, the mission of my organization? So I've always shied away from that. So I'm asking that question in terms of you, which is again outlier and exception to the rule. How, and this may be off from the line of questioning, and we'll get back to it. But I just wanted to know for other young people who are looking at college and doctoral as, the direction. My to you, Dr. David, what, if any, challenges have you faced in your passion? Because I when I went to college, when I first felt the brunt of racism from my professors, and it was off-putting for me. As a young man, I was what, 19? Yeah, 19, and I'm feeling it. How were you able to keep your passion, keep your authenticity while going through an educational system that's designed to stifle that, to tramp on it? Or if you have passion, you're going to have passion for continuing, developing, and helping the system succeed, not in going against the system, helping this demographic that we're purposely trying to disenfranchise. We don't need that passion. How are you able to navigate that course, if you don't mind sharing, and then we'll get back to the line of
Definitely. No, I appreciate that. It was really from the support of other people who are also going through it, and then folks who have been through it, right? So there were older folks who were willing to say, all right, look, young blood, let me guess. This just happened, right? And then you go, yeah, you hot about it, like no, like, I'm about to get out on these fools, and then they're like, look, okay, when this happens, this is what you need to do. This happens, this is what you need to do. Don't worry about all the stuff, because if you start to respond to every little thing, you get distracted. So now, how do you actually keep focused with all these distractions, right? And it doubles itself up. So like in undergrad, I was an athlete too, right? So, you seeing all this other stuff, and you looking around and you saying to yourself like, man, what is really going on? And then it takes, an OG to be like, look, this is what you saw. Nope, you're not crazy. This is what it is. Yep, it's some
important
bullshit. Right, it's some bullshit. Don't get pressed on that. Go over here. In fact, one of the OGs, and again, a lot of this came by way of peers, right? So I actually, when it came time for me to finish undergrad, they said I needed an extra class. And one of the homies was like, no, why? He was like, look, this is what needs to happen. You're gonna go over to this building, you're gonna talk to you're gonna go up to the third floor, you're gonna wait. You're gonna wait for this sister named Dean Hodges. He says there's gonna be a lot of white people in there. They asking you, can they help you? Blah, 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 blah. All you say to them is, no, I'm waiting for Dean Hodges. Whatever you got to do, stay in the seat and wait. Dean Hodges comes out. She was like, Stovall, right? Like, yes, ma'am. She was like, come in the office real quick. She said, let me guess. They said you got an extra class. You need to take an extra class, or some about withholding your graduation. She was like, look, grab that sheet of paper on my desk. I'm going to sign it. Take it over across the street. They're going to be super mad. They're going to get red in the face. Congratulations on your graduation. That was it, right? And she was just like, because she already knew. She was like, look, I know how these people operate. Like, I know what they do. I know how they think. So here's what we're going to do. So a sheet of paper with her signature that said, I completed the requirements. Boom, done. Yeah, so that thing around really being attuned to, the folks who have had that experience, but also who have not succumbed to that experience, right? The people who say, look, we in this place, but we are not of this place. We got a whole different set of work to do. We know the work that you're doing. We trust you in doing that work. Go do that work. We're going to make the path for you to do this work. But be clear that you're going to go through these particular obstacles, right? That's just being Black. That's just living. Right. So now, how will you do this to go back, be with collectives of people, be with folks who are trying to do similar things? So that was really important. The people who were doing the work were really key to me getting through those places that were not meant for me to get through, and had the understanding that I shouldn't be there in the first place.
Yo, he's dropping gems. Yo, Cal, he's dropping gems.
Yes, sir.
Yo, Dr. David, yo, you killed it, man. You don't know how many young people go. All right, so follow-up question real quick. How did you find those people? I mean, because it's one thing, you got a community, and that makes sense. You got a community that supports you. One of the biggest challenges, how do I, like, young people are like, well, how do I find these people? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really useful for me is I was just talking to folks. I was like, all right, man, who's down here doing the work? And I actually so where I went to undergrad, I had a cousin who went there before me. Okay. And it was a group of people who were doing some organizing work. So I linked up with them. That's how I met the people from Detroit. I met them through them. So now it's with younger folks, it's in this day and age, it's easier to see the people who are doing similar work, but it may be more challenging to find them in your locale. So now it's that digging that you have to do, and like you do, Kaide, with 4Ts. It's like, okay, well, here's my interest. Now, who are the people in the universe who do this work, right? Who are some folks local that I can link to? And then when I talk to folks, you can really see who's supportive and who's not, right? So now, what's the litmus that I use for folks being supportive? Like, so for me, it was always who hit me back, or when I reached out to somebody, who hit me back. That was the first litmus. The second piece was when they actually put something on the table for me to get down with, who showed up when I showed up to that thing that they were trying to do. So it's really around having a litmus about that accountability, but also being very clear or digging deeper into those interests. And it'll take some digging, and sometimes it won't pan out in the best way, but the issue is really continuing to do it, right? So now, if I'm interested in this thing, who are the folks who are supportive? Now, how do I keep in tune with them? And then on the back end, how do I share that with other people who might be interested? So I think that really becomes important, because like I said, in a world of social media, what have you, you can see people all over the world who are doing certain things, but you might not be able to get in contact with them. So now what do we know locally? And now can we share globally? So I think that those things around really putting it into context.
Thank you. That's good. That's a nice roadmap, brother. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Cal. I'm sorry.
No, that was a great question, Kaide, because we talk about these resources in general, but in regard to where to go, where to look, how to ask, when we talk about self-advocacy and self-efficacy with my students, that's a huge thing, because sometimes we don't know to ask, or sometimes we're ashamed to ask, because society has conditioned us to say, if you ask, you're weak. You should already know it, or you should have it. What's wrong with you? And it's like, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with my environment? That's creating this situation. And that's where I'm at in my development, is that it's less about the people and more about the environment that shape these behaviors. And it's always been there, but this is just my coming into the awareness of it. It's always been there. And I want to ask you, you mentioned it just now, with the social media and the technology, the so-called technology, electronic devices that we use, do you feel like that's hindered education, or do you feel like that has added a multitude of possibilities for education? Because when we talk about technology, it's typically in the scope of those who are programming it, like you said earlier, those who are programming it are not of us, not of color, not of ethnicity, not of the people per se, as far as what they need. So I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, I had a prof in grad school who was like a straight up Luddite. And when I mean like a Luddite to the next level. To give you a sense of this dude, he had, when you would go in his office, he had typewriters stacked on top of each other. And he was like, yeah, man, it's kind of like, he was like, man, he would say, man, I apologize for my office being a typewriter graveyard. So his and one of his guys was like, look, man, I got this quick thing. Like you should mess with it. Because on his syllabus, to give y'all a sense of this, on his syllabus, he listed 3 numbers. He was like, look, if you call any of these 3 numbers and I do not answer, there's something wrong. He was just like, he was just that much understanding of how technology can operate in particular ways. So his homie showed him email, and he was like, and he came to class and he was like, y'all, this email thing, I really like it. We were like, whoa. Like he was like, man, I really like it. Cause so he would say this thing. He said, the more technologically advanced a society becomes, the easier it is to destroy it. So now it's a thing around what is the usage of the technology, right? So, and usage is very different from dependence.
Okay.
Right? So to what extent, because if you use it to do something, then it can be of use, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you are dependent on it,
right,
that's when it becomes problematic.
Right.
Right. And I think that's the conversation that I think we should be having in relationship to technology, right? Of what use is it, right? And then, or is it creating a particular dependence, right? So when we talk about cell phones, you know, now physicians, psychologists, neurologists, they talk about, you know, we need to be thinking about cellular addictions, right? And it's literally the way in which long-term contact with cellular usage literally shifts the way the brain responds, right? So it's really around, if we can limit that and now figure out what is viable usage of it, then we can do things differently, right? So I think it's always a usage versus dependence question that we should be asking around technology. But this thing around, and I've been trying to pay more attention to the folks who do addiction science, who say, like, look, we have to think about the way this thing is reconfiguring our brain. And now how do we engage in that in a way that we are not dependent on it for our sustenance and function, right? So I think that's a question and a tough one to engage, because we're so imbued to certain forms of technology as part of our everyday life, right? But now I think when we ask the question more around usage and utility over dependence, then we can actually use it in I think some really important ways in terms of messaging, in terms of sharing info. So those are the ways in which I think about it in the current moment.
To that point, to add to your point, David, and I think it should be understood, but just for clarity purposes, not only just the cell phones, but the social media apps, because they've done studies on Instagram, and there was a news feed that I saw with a father and his daughter, where they exposed her, and a lot of parents are doing this to this day ad nauseum. They exposed their daughter to YouTube and Instagram, and she was only 10, 11, 12, something like that, 13 years old. And now at 18, she's like narcissistic, the whole nine, feeding off of the likes, the attention, to her own detriment, to where her father took her out of his not the will or something like that, because the daughter's turned on the father because of the lies of the mother, and now she's turning on the mother who helped her. These are people who helped her to do it, but it's all because of that indoctrination, that programming, that training, that, like you said, that dependency on technology, especially in terms of the influence social media is having on young people as well as adults. So I just wanted to add to that point. Good point.
That's a good point. That's really an excellent point. Because to quote the famous, hip hop activist Chuck D, say, we're raising screen ages. You know what I'm saying? All these screens. And how that's affecting us, how we engage with each other, and that goes into my next kind of question too, because we're in the classrooms, and you're in multiple classrooms, different school systems. What have you seen as far as any patterns in schools? Because when we talked about schools, we had another guest on, Akil Bello, another good brother. He talked about how certain schools were not even built to engage students or train students to go into college. If they want to go into these institutions, whether it be P.W.I.s or HW.Is or HBCUs. And for me as an educator, I really never really thought about it because I just assumed, and I feel kind of embarrassed a little bit, because it's like I always assumed that, in a sense, I knew that schools were not necessarily for us, but I typically thought that high schools were pipeline into college for the most part. So you traveling and having your experience working in the field and doing research, have you seen any changes, positive or negative, in regard to how schools engage with our youth? Because again, a lot of youth seem like the push out rate, or what they call dropout rate, is exponentially getting larger.
Yeah. And I think what we have to put into context first is the difference between schooling and education.
Okay.
I think those are two different things. Right? So schooling is really this reward system that rewards you for being able to regurgitate the rules of white supremacy, right? I mean, there's not a lot of affect in schooling, right? And to your point, Kyle, you're in some of these places and it's not meant to do right by anybody that comes through it, right? And where education is saying, okay, how do I engage in a process of learning and developing skills that are beneficial to the folks that I care about to change conditions in the places like the ones that I come from, right? So I always make that delineation between schooling and education. So now I'm always, anytime, any schoolhouse I go to, I'm always asking myself, okay, is this space really centered around schooling, or is this place trying to engage in a practice of education?
Good question.
Right?
Yeah.
So and the question I'm always asking myself is, can education happen in these places that we call schools in terms of the ways in which they're structured? So what I've seen is that when people are explicit and self-determining, there's greater possibility in that schoolhouse. If they have just gone the route of compliance, then that place is much more committed to schooling, right? And I think that's always been the conundrum. And what I've seen, to your point, is we have more places that are just in that system of compliance, right? And when young folks are in that space around that compliance, there's also a mechanism that just wrongfully punishes them for nothing, right? And, I think we really have to go into this understanding around what we would never accept that as an adult. Why do we have that expectation on young people, right? That space would be unacceptable to us, right? We will walk out in 2 seconds. But when a young person refutes it, now there's something wrong with them. And I'm saying to myself, anytime we see young folks rejecting the compliance of the school, we shouldn't be asking a question around the deviance of the young person. More importantly, we should be asking a question around the function of that schoolhouse, right? And I think that's a tougher question, because we now have to center ourselves as older folks in that equation. It's not just them over there, right? It's
Right.
actually, how are we all in this space, right? And that thing around the expectations of a space, if it's around learning, will look substantively different if the focus is just compliance, right? Because the compliance does not equate to any form of learning, right? So now we got to think about, well, where are the places where folks are engaged in learning, practicing, demonstrating, creating, and now thinking about that space. And I've seen the separation between the two places get deeper, right?
Right.
It's when you go into a place where folks are learning, it looks completely different.
It does. It feels different.
Right. It feels different, right?
Mm-hmm.
You move in a place differently.
Mm-hmm.
In opposed to a place that is just committed to schooling, right? And two of my guys, and I think they're absolutely right when they make this assessment. They say, look, if we look at a school that doesn't have resources, that has not been tended well to by the district, that has all of these problems internally, externally, and with the school structure, they say we shouldn't even look at that as a bad school. We should understand that as a school that is doing exactly what it was intended to do under white supremacy.
Wow.
Right? So that's a functioning school under white supremacy.
Yeah.
Right. And and now it makes so now I'm always think about, well, what's the interruption to that? Right? How do you actively interrupt that thing that we know to exist? Right? And that's a space where you build out more towards education.
That's a lot. I like that. I now you got me thinking on some strategy solutions to that. With that said, Doc, what are some factors that determine a good school versus a hood school? Why doesn't America have more good schools?
Right. And one of my guys, brother named Kevin Kumashiro, he broke this thing down to me. He was like, man, look, we gotta think about schooling in the United States. And he broke this thing down. He's like, man, look, even under white supremacy, schooling wasn't even intended to educate white people. Right? He was like, look, man, he was like, you said this how serious this thing is. Wow. He was like, man, it wasn't even intended to educate them, right? It was to be this system of training, and that was about it, right? It was to be training for servitude. Right. So now you may got a little skill, you may get a little factory gig, but now you in servitude to folks. Right. So he was like, look, you have to think about, so now if that was the gate for white folks, you can imagine under white supremacy what we would get. Right. So this thing around this, and in many cases, these old white dudes used to tell on themselves, right? So I would always have my students look at the work of Noah Webster. So Noah Webster, we know him for dictionaries, what have you, but Noah Webster was an educator. And he wrote all of these pieces around democracy. And he would write this thing, he would say, look, well, true democracy would lead to total anarchy. And to prevent anarchy, we need a system of training that develops commitment to country and nation.
Makes sense.
Right? So so this thing around, so he's saying this, like, this is Webster's words, like he's putting this in the conversation. So this, to your question, Kaide, it's always, well, look, you have a country that actually has reserved education for the well-to-do. So now we have to think about, we live in a country where it's not really committed to education beyond the level of training and servitude. So for people who rule, it's it looks completely different. So a question that one of my homies would always ask in Chicago is, who's taught to rule and who's taught to obey? And to your question, Kaede, the reason why we have so many schools that are under-resourced, disinvested, marginalized, and isolated, because we live in a country that says those are the people who should be obeying. Because the schools where people who are ruling look completely different, right? And we get the false narrative of you only deserve that thing that teaches folks to rule if you do all these other things, right? And it's a false play, right? I mean, it's a con,
Yeah.
right? So this thing around really putting that into the broader context and saying, look, we have to ask a larger question of national commitment to education, and because there's never been one, right? So this thing around really putting in the context that though we have so many schools in the places like the ones that we come from, because we have a society that says we can't have a space to teach those folks how to self-determine, because if we teach those folks how to self-determine, or if they teach themselves how to self-determine, there will be no more commitment to us. Right? And I think and that's always the conundrum, because folks on the block are like, fuck this place. Like we not down with any of this, right?
Right.
But at the same time, that's not to say that they're not committed to learning, right? That they're not committed to wanting to improve conditions, right? It's just the structure that folks have been given is inadequate, right? So it's always that thing around, how do folks self-determine to figure out what's necessary and a better, more congruent with folks' needs. But yeah, like I think that's a question that that's a historical question that we really have to engage if we are taking it seriously.